All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the second winter now 2022 BEAD Core research seminar. Um, I I just want, before we get started, I want to say, in case you aren't familiar with the BEAD Core, we provide research support services to faculty throughout the institution, and we do have several departments who are supported to have faculty work with us at 20 supported hours per fiscal year. So please email beadcore@jhmi.edu if you want more information or if you'd like to figure out how to sign up for services. We would be very happy to help you. I also, sorry, I'm admitting people as I'm talking. I want to introduce our speaker today, so we have plenty of time for questions. Amelia Brandt is our presenter today. She has a DrPH from Tulane and an M.S.W and M.P.H from Washington University. She works now with us in the Department of Pediatrics, and she serves as a lead for the BEAD Core, helping with especially our qualitative research service line. And she also works at Centro Sol in their research group and at the Center for Communications Programs as a research and evaluation officer. So we're really looking forward to hearing what she has to say today about qualitative research. So let me go ahead and hand over the reins to Amelia. Welcome.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. It's really great to be able to be part of this and to share a little bit about qualitative methods. So you already know a little bit about who I am. Thank you, Laura, for that introduction. Before getting started, I just want to give a special thanks to Suzanne Grebe, who many of you will know at the BEAD Core, as well as David Seal, who was my qualitative methods professor at Tulane. I drew a lot on information from them and presentations that they've given in the past to help put this together. So I just want to thank them before we get started. So just a really brief overview of kind of what I'm going to try to cover today. So I'm kind of taking a what, when, and how approach. So what is qualitative research? When is it best to use? How do I do it? And how do I get funding to do it? So we'll hopefully get through all of that. I'm going to have to try to keep an eye on time. So I know it's a lot to cover. And just to kind of give a sense of who this is really targeted to, this is really for people who do not have a lot of experience with qualitative research and are interested in learning more about it and how to get into it. So if you have some experience already, some of this may be information that you already know. And I think my experience with qualitative research has really taught me how to be a lifelong learner, as I realized that as I learn more methods and I do more research, it really brings out what I don't know and what I want to know more about. So I recognize that people on this seminar have their own lived experiences and their own experience with qualitative research. So what I'd like to do just to start is, if Laura, if you can just launch the poll, I'd kind of like to get a sense of what level of experience we're working with. And then I can think when we get, maybe, I don't know, 20 responses or 30 or so, we can start to show those, give people a couple minutes.
All right, I think we're at 75%. Let's try it.
All right. Okay. All right, great. Okay, so it looks like we have a good range, which is great. And as we go through, if you have kind of pieces that you'd like to add or experiences that you'd like to mention, you can definitely put those in the chat, and we can hopefully have time for discussion at the end. And then the second piece that I wanted to do before we get started is to have a sense of what's most important to you all to learn. So Laura, if you want to launch the second poll.
All right, let me just figure out how to find the second poll. Cameron, do you have
the drop down at the top of the polls, maybe?
Ah, no, let's see here. Maybe people can just put it in the chat. I can't seem to
Yeah,
find
that sounds fine. Yep. So yeah, if you want to kind of put into the chat kind of what you're most interested in learning about today, and that's just helpful for me to kind of know as we go forward. Great. Funding. Yeah. Okay. All right. Wonderful. So just jumping right in then, what is qualitative research? So qualitative research sometimes is referred to as the word science. So words instead of numbers, although that is kind of now a misnomer as we are getting more research that focuses on photos and recordings and videos and different things and expanding what we mean by the word science. It tends to focus on the why and how rather than the what. And it can be really complementary to quantitative research. So for example, we may see a phenomenon or a health disparity or something happening, and we know that this is what's happening, but we may not know why or how or what it means. And unlike quantitative research, it always takes place in the natural world. There are no labs for qualitative research. Everything is out there in the world. And fundamentally, you have to interpret what you're learning. It is much more subjective than quantitative methods, which can be really challenging as you're getting started.
Amelia, I'll just point out you have a lot of answers to what people want to learn about.
Yes, I can see that. Yeah, so maybe I'll just take a look. So it looks like analysis is a big one, funding, software, analysis, protocols. Okay, social media, okay, yep. So we won't be getting too much, great. So we won't get too deeply into analysis because I'm focusing on the getting started piece. But I will say that analysis can be often the most challenging, but starting out the right way makes analysis a lot easier. So I hope to kind of outline some of what that looks like. So wonderful. So getting into kind of a little bit more of the characteristics of qualitative research, it is holistic. So you're embracing the complexity of the world, whereas in quantitative research, we're trying to kind of simplify things a little bit into different variables and what's dependent and independent and understanding how those relate. With qualitative research, we're really embracing the complexity of all of these different things and what the meaning is, what the different perspectives are, and have a really deep understanding and a rich description of things and taking the context into account. So instead of trying to kind of account for the context, we are including it as part of the research. So that could look like interpersonal relationships, culture, systems, all kinds of things. And it is emergent, so you have to be ready to let the data tell you a lot of things as you're going. So we start out with some a priori work, but you have to be open to listening to the data as you go. When to use a qualitative approach. So there are lots of different ways that qualitative research can be really useful. For exploratory research, it's really powerful. So if we're seeing things happening in the world that we don't really understand that much, or we're not sure why they're happening, qualitative research really helps us start to understand that and can help move the research forward and can sometimes be the first step of moving towards mixed methods research or quantitative research as we start to understand better what questions to ask. And it also can help provide context and meaning. So especially with human behavior, if we know that people are, some people are getting tested for HIV, other people are not, but we don't understand what the difference is between the people who are and the people who aren't. Or maybe we understand a demographic, we know that there's a demographic difference, but we don't understand the reason for it. It helps us provide context and meaning and is really important towards creating health behavior theories and moving things forward in health and social behavior change research and programming. And we also can use it we have always in public health and in health in general, there are really difficult and problems that seem intractable, that seem really hard to move the needle forward. And qualitative research can help kind of shake that up and bring in new perspectives that we haven't heard before, and start to move forward with innovation. And then also, we have to be honest and candid that sometimes people do qualitative research because they think their funder will like it. I think it kind of brings a little extra in, which is being pragmatic. I think it's great that funders are starting to like qualitative research more. And as long as you take the time and do it well, if the funder liking it gets qualitative research moving forward, I'm fine with that. Here we just see kind of there are lots and lots of qualitative studies that are existing in health research. Some of them focus on values, some of them focus on barriers and facilitators to behavior, some of them are evaluation. There's really kind of no limit to what you can study using qualitative methods. It can be applied to really almost any topic area, and is really powerful. Then getting into, just before I move on, I just want to just see if we have any questions so far. Anything burning, if you want to put it in the chat. Okay. All right. So getting into the nuts and bolts, how do I do it? So getting started and choosing an approach. I think the first thing for qualitative research is getting into a qualitative state of mind. So if you are used to doing quantitative research, you are going to think about things in a quantitative way initially. So you might be thinking, how do I answer this question? What's the counterfactual? What are the variables? Where with a qualitative state of mind, you might want to pay more attention in your day-to-day things that you see that make you say, I wonder why, or I wonder how this could happen, or I wish I understood more about, this population or this group. And kind of note those things down, and that'll help you start to think about questions that might be appropriate for a qualitative approach. Then, of course, reading qualitative research will help you see what can be done with it. And just thinking about the context and embracing the complexity of the world you live in. I think those are all things that help you get in a qualitative state of mind. And then you kind of have to choose an approach. So there are some very specific approaches like ethnography, phenomenology, grounded theory, and case study. And these have really strict methodological requirements. And if you're just beginning in qualitative research, these may not be the right fit for what you're looking for, but you can also use generic or general inquiry, which is another option that's often more appropriate if you're adding on a qualitative aim, or if you're doing a qualitative study for the first time. So this is not guided by an explicit or established set of philosophical assumptions or interpretive paradigms. It's more dictated by the practical requirements of your research question. So it is more pragmatic, but therefore, in order for it to still be rigorous, you really need to be explicit in describing your research process and incorporating best practices. And so you should since it's not as well dictated, you need, for each decision that you make, you need to have a rationale for why you're choosing that. If you're choosing focus groups rather than interview, you need to be able to say why. So for each thing, you need to be able to explain why. Then I also just wanted to mention case studies, because case studies, I think, are also particularly applicable for public health and health research. So a case study is a holistic approach where you're looking at a specific case. So a case could be an individual clinic, an individual person, and you can do that either in a single location or across multiple contexts. And what makes this really powerful is the triangulation. So you can have maybe, for example, the example that I stole from Suzanne was a positive deviance case study of a high-performing maternity unit. So this is an example of, we know that this unit is doing really well, but we don't really understand why. So we're going to do this case study and understand why. And so this triangulation is really important, because if you just did observations, or you just did interviews, or you just did focus groups, you might not get the full picture. So the importance of the power of a qualitative approach to a case study is that triangulation. And it can be really, really appropriate for things like this, like a positive deviance, where you're seeing a really good outcome and you're not sure why. It can also be appropriate if a program is doing really well everywhere except for one place, and you want to know what's going on there. Can also be if you're finding unexpected outcomes, that can be good, or a pilot program where you really are wanting to understand if it worked, why it worked, whether it is whether it's something that can be applied somewhere else. So I see a question in the chat: how generalizable are case studies? So they tend to not, the case study itself, you're not, the research itself is giving a really clear understanding of what's happening in a particular context. And so the piece of it that is generalizable, or that can be generalizable, is what aspect of that situation is something that could be repeated somewhere else. So if something has to do with culture or language or things like that, that may be, you may say, well, this was successful because of something that's really unique to this case. But if you find that maybe a part of it that seemed to be really important was supportive supervision really made this work, or different, something that could be replicated, then that information helps you understand. So in this sense, and this is really powerful for program evaluation, which is my next piece. By using a qualitative approach to program evaluation, and also in a case study approach, this helps you understand why a program worked and whether it might work somewhere else, because you're starting to understand what were the pieces. So that just kind of brought me into the next thing, which is evaluation. So qualitative techniques are really powerful to include in monitoring and evaluation plans. So you can have a plan where maybe your goals are more numeric, but if you include these qualitative techniques, it gives you insights into what Scriven calls the black box, which is you have your starting point here, your goals are over here, and what happened in the middle. And so this will help you understand. So let's say you had a great intervention, it met the goals, but you want to know why. Why did we meet the goals? And was the theory of change that we had, did that work? Or was there a piece of the theory of change that actually didn't work? So maybe we need to make some changes. What were the contextual factors that seemed to be really important for this working? And then you kind of use all of that information to determine whether that whether that intervention is appropriate for somewhere else, and what are the factors that are most important. You can also have evaluations that are primarily qualitative, that are really focused on the participant experience and figuring out how something can be improved. So kind of some of that patient-centered outcome sort of work, really looking at the experience and letting people share their perspective. So then moving on to data collection. So there are many, many data collection methods, both primary and secondary. Primary is what most people think of. Most of what people will describe as, when people say qualitative methods, they think interviews, focus groups, which are very powerful and are used a lot. There are also other ways that you can gather data. Community mapping is a really interesting one, of having people map out their community and see how they perceive their world. Participant observation in different settings. There are new things that are being developed now that are mobile phone based. One that I've worked with is called Engage, where you kind of take the questions that you might use for an interview and you adapt them to a mobile phone program that sends out questions, and people can respond by text message, by voice note, by photo. So it's kind of more of an ethnographic, sort of a mix of photo, voice, and interview. And it's an interesting approach. But you can also have data that already exists that is really interesting for qualitative work. So if you are doing evaluation, reviewing the program records, even things like meeting notes, participant feedback, supervision reports, all kinds of things. There's so much data that can be really important for evaluation. And you can also really do a lot with social media and news media. We have a very information heavy world these days. And so you see a lot of research that's done with information from Twitter, with things from TikTok, with things from Facebook. In my dissertation research, I actually used information from a rumor reporting program where people were texted in rumors. And I used that to learn about how rumors changed over time and how rumors were different in different places in different parts of a country. So there's a lot of information out there that you can kind of cut your teeth on in a way to kind of get used to dealing with words and not numbers. And then getting into choosing a data collection method. So it should be driven by what your research question is. So sometimes that's more obvious. For example, if you want to understand how people are acting in a certain setting, you want to observe them, you don't want to interview them. Whereas if you want to understand why they're acting in that way, you might want to interview them. But sometimes it can be more difficult to decide between some that are more similar, like an interview versus a focus group discussion. But the important thing is it shouldn't be driven by what's easiest or just by your preference. You should be able to explain why something is done. I have sometimes heard people say, well, let's just do focus group discussions because we only have to do 5, and I'd rather do 5 focus group discussions than 30 interviews. And so that, of course, is not how you should decide. So a couple of things to consider as you are deciding between an interview or a focus groups. Excuse me. An interview is going to provide more depth. You're going to have the one-on-one chance, and people are going to be able to explain more about their personal experience, their personal perspective. But if you're interested for your topic of understanding how people interact together or how people speak about things in a group, focus groups allow for that kind of analysis. And so you can look for things like self-censorship or desire to conform and things like that. You can also consider the salience or how relevant a topic is to people. If you are focusing on something that people may not think about too much on a daily basis, you might want to do a focus group discussion because people may be more likely to kind of play off of each other and you will get richer information. Whereas if you're just one-on-one with someone, they may feel a little bit put on the spot and they may have a hard time really telling you very much about the topic because they haven't thought about it that much before that time. You may also want to consider, you want to also consider the size of your target population. If you are focusing on a really specific and small group where there's a lot of interaction and people are likely to know each other, then that can be really difficult with a focus group because you will have dynamics between people who know each other, and you also may have people feel like they can't be open. And you also should consider that the type of information that you're asking about, because confidentiality cannot be guaranteed in a focus group. You yourself can do your part to protect the information, but you can't guarantee that when someone leaves a focus group discussion, they're not going to say, well, someone said this. And so especially if you have people who know each other, that can be a concern. And if you're talking about sensitive issues. And I bring in the analysis plan here in data collection because your analysis plan should be determined before you start gathering data, because it should inform how you gather that data. So you can think about whether you are looking at individual level or group, macro or micro questions. And here's just an example of a thematic content analysis plan where you have your specific aim. And then from that, you think about what topics you're going to use and what your analytic questions are. And this is something that's not something you have to use. This is something that I like to use because it helps me determine what my interview guide looks like. Because everything that you include in your interview guide, every question should be tied to some analysis. The interview guide is a living document. So You create the document based on your analysis plan and what you're trying to learn, but you can tweak it over time. And as you work on it, you want to understand and account for your personal bias. I always recommend having, I think it's best to not have just one person develop your guide. It's good to have more than one person so that you can see different people's biases and take that into account and understand that as you move forward. As well as it can be good to have an objective person come in, someone who's outside of your topic area, outside of your area of expertise, to see if it makes sense to someone who's not an expert in that area. As a general rule, most people like to put more sensitive questions later on in the guide, so you've already gained a little rapport. And just a couple things that I've seen with interview guides that can happen. A lot of people try to put in too many questions. You're trying to cover too much ground. As a general rule for myself, I like to consider no more than 10 questions so that I have at least 5 to 10 minutes for the person to answer each. No, that's not right. But so I have enough time for the person to answer each question. If you get to more than 10 questions, especially if you're having the real meat of the interview later on, you might not get to the end, or people might start to get tired and not really be giving you the best answers as you get towards the end. I'll see people sometimes put in survey style questions. So they'll include demographic questions or yes, no questions, or have you experienced this? Yes, no, if so. So kind of writing in the same way that you might in a survey. And then also you can see sometimes people will put in probes that are actually separate questions. Your probes should not be able to stand on their own. A probe you should consider that the question yourself, the question they are answering, the question they are asking rather, is opening the door, and the probes are starting to kind of push into the room to get more information about that topic. So you want to avoid having a probe that kind of switches you to a different door. A couple interview tips. Generally, you want to take about an hour. You should plan for that, tell people about an hour. It's a good idea to practice your interview guide ahead of time and pilot it if you can, to see if you can get through it in an hour or not. And I know we all like to have lots of busy schedules, but it's great to provide yourself buffer time. So you want time before the interview to prepare yourself and get into the right headspace to be in a one-on-one interview with someone. And then you want to also give yourself time at the end, because the last thing that you want is to be in a great interview and be getting great information, and you have to cut off the participant because you have something else happening. So you want to make sure you have that buffer and let yourself deviate from the guide. It is a guide. It's not a survey. So if you find that someone has a lot to say about a particular question and it's really good, let yourself kind of go down that path and see what they have to say. Or if someone brings up something that was really unexpected and you really want to explore that, that's fine. And, go and see that, because the purpose of qualitative research is you're trying to understand people's experiences and have that rich data. And so it's possible that maybe you didn't have the interview guide exactly right. And maybe there are other questions that would be good to add. And you can do that as you keep doing the interviews and you're getting more information, because it is iterative and it is a living document. Keep your time in mind, because you're backloading with the really important questions. You want to make sure you're not getting bogged down in like the first 2 or 3 questions and then not having time for the ones that you're really, really interested in. So kind of if you ask, a question and someone gives a really complete answer and you don't feel like you need to do any probes, that's fine. You can move on. Be comfortable with silence. This is really difficult, I think, culturally, but people feel really uncomfortable when someone doesn't respond right away. But sometimes your questions might be very personal, or they might take some thought. So it's fine to ask your question, take a few beats, and let someone kind of consider what they want to say. before you jump in with a probe. Try to avoid self-disclosure. This is another kind of tendency that we have, is we want to find ways to relate with people. We want to find ways to find connection. So someone may say, I have a really hard time, switching gears in the middle of the day. And you say, oh yeah, me too. But you want to kind of avoid doing that, because then you're kind of playing with the dynamic. And you want to make sure that it's about what the person's saying. Try to mirror participants' language, both body language and their verbal language. If you have a certain term that you're using within the interview guide and the participant has a different term that they're using for the same thing, switch to their term, because then you're showing that you're listening and you're building rapport. And finally, just practice empathy, because a lot of times we are asking people about really personal things, about their health status, about their lived experiences. And it can be really hard for people to be sharing those things. And so it's really important to provide a safe space where people feel comfortable. For focus groups, generally you want your size to be 6 to 10. If it's something that people maybe are less familiar with or haven't thought about as much, you may want more people to keep the conversation going than the opposite. If it's something that you think people are going to have a lot to say about, generally you want to over recruit by about 20%. To account for no-shows, which will happen. Facilitation is really challenging. And if you have never done it before, I would recommend either seeing if you can add someone to your research team who has done focus group facilitation, or spending some time learning how to do that, because there are a lot of pieces, a lot of pieces to keep in mind. In terms of discussion guides, they should be a bit shorter than an interview guide, because you have more people that you're trying to get their feedback. So I usually recommend about 6 to 8 questions. And if you're not sure, consider how many participants you want to include and how many questions you have and how much time you're giving, and kind of do the math to see if everyone answered each question, how much time would they each have. And then just a bit about data collection ethics. So you want to make sure you provide a safe and private place for people. This is more difficult with COVID, where we're not able to do research in person as much. And people may not have a private place that they can go. So you might have to be a little bit creative there. Remember and say frequently that participants can skip any question that they want, and they can stop at any time. It's really important to consider patient safety. As I mentioned, you might be talking to people about things that are really sensitive. And if you are working with people who may have mental health concerns, consider whether you need to have a suicidality protocol in place. Or if you are bringing up issues that may cause distress, it may be a good idea to have mental health support, have a free counselor who can speak with someone, or have referrals to free services. And then in that same vein, if you're talking with people about specific health issues, they may talk to you in that interview or in that focus group discussion and say, well, I lost my insurance, or I'm having trouble with this, or I'm having trouble with that, depending on what your topic is. So you want to try to link to appropriate services and have those things in place, because it really is difficult for participants if they are speaking with you about all of these challenges that they're facing, and then at the end of the interview you say, well, great, it was great to talk to you, good luck with those challenges. So you're doing a lot better if you are anticipating that people are going to talk about challenges, and here are some resources for that. Is really helpful. I see a few questions in the chat. I'm just going to look. Okay, software. Okay. Yeah, so facilitation, it looks like Kate Fasano is sharing my learning course on facilitation. And I can also do a little look and see what else I can find. And sometimes it just like watching someone who has done it a lot can be helpful. And I know I can share some other resources that I know of. Okay, great. So jumping right into sampling. So sampling, of course, for qualitative research is different. We are not trying to generalize, but there are things that we are considering. So what is your research question, and what strategy is going to be most effective to get the data that you need for that question? What's the best strategy that's possible given the population that you're seeking, the data that you want, and what's possible within your budget? And so you want to think about that from the very beginning of, if you're applying for a certain grant, what is the budget? And then that should also kind of be guiding what your research question is and what you can really do well with the money that you have. Most of the time, you're going to use purposive sampling. So that's where you're trying to find the people who can best provide the information about what you are trying to learn about. You will sometimes see convenience sampling, where you're just kind of talking to who is easily available to you. And that can be really appropriate if you are kind of just trying to learn about a specific phenomena, trying to get the temperature of something, or maybe you're noticing something, but you're not really sure what the research question is yet. You're kind of just out there exploring, trying to figure out a little bit more about it so that you can develop a research question that is more rigorous. But generally, convenience sampling is not a very rigorous method. There are a number of different purposive sampling approaches. I'm just going to go through a couple of those. So one is a representative or homogeneous sample. So this is where you're trying to get a deep understanding of one particular group. And one of the questions that we might get is, how homogeneous should it be? And a good way to think about that is, if you are looking at a specific group, think about your typical sample size. So if you're doing interviews, you're looking at around 30. If you're doing focus group discussions, probably like 5 to 7. And if you think about that group of people and what your inclusion and exclusion criteria are, do you imagine that you're going to gain saturation with that amount? Or are you anticipating that there's going to be a lot of variation? Like maybe you're looking at like adolescent Latinos in Baltimore City, and you're thinking, okay, maybe there's going to be a lot of variation between males and females, or maybe there's going to be a lot of variation between Central American immigrants and something. And so if you can picture in your head that there are some really specific differences that are probably going to make it difficult to get saturation, you might want to consider splitting those into different groups. So you can have sort of cells. So instead of just saying, I'm looking at adolescent Latinos, you can say, looking at adolescent Latinos and having two groups, one male, one female. And then you're, taking that into account. Another is maximum variation. This is something that's really appropriate for comparative analyses, where you're trying to see the differences between something. So a specific variation, you want to have a specific variation of interest. So something that you're focusing on as you're comparing. So maybe that's race, maybe that's age, maybe it's location. So you aren't just trying to get the most random sample that you can. You're trying to really see, picking two groups, that are different, and you're trying to see how that difference looks. And then another is a special, unique, or critical case. So this is something where it's very specific. So maybe someone who's experienced a very specific medical issue, or someone who has had a very specific life experience. And you're kind of looking specifically for a pretty small group of people, and you're going pretty deeply into that. And then snowball sampling, which you'll hear about a lot, is less of a approach and more of a technique, because it can be used for a lot of things. So it can be appropriate for different approaches. So if you are trying to get a representative sample, but it's a population that's really difficult to reach, then you may want to have a snowball sampling approach so that you are able to get enough people to reach saturation. With special or critical cases, that can also be helpful, especially if it's a life experience or something where there are a lot of connections between people who have had that same experience. Then snowball sampling can be really helpful to kind of get to the sample that you need. One caveat is that if you do have to use snowball sampling for difficult to reach populations, this is going to reduce the representativeness of that sample. So you do need to then include that in your limitations. And when you're doing snowball sampling, it's good to have cards with your contact information, because what's most likely to happen is the people that you speak to are going to pass along your information to other people rather than passing other people's information to you. So you want to have your information ready and easy to share. Then sample size, really debated. There's a lot of back and forth on this. Saturation is what you'll hear most often is this will be our sample or until saturation is reached. There are a lot of different kinds of saturation, and there is debate there as well. But as a general rule, when you stop hearing anything new, or when you kind of start an interview and you already kind of know what people are going to say, that's when you are probably about to your sample that you need. As a rule of thumb, for a homogeneous group, I would recommend 30 to 40 interviews, 5 to 12 focus groups. For heterogeneous groups, where I talked about, so if you are dividing by gender or age, you want to have 10 to 15 interviews per group or 2 to 3 focus groups per group. Okay, and then just jumping into analysis. And as I mentioned, I'm not going to go into quite as much detail on this because this is kind of on down the line and I'm focused on getting you started. But as I mentioned, you should not wait until your data is collected to figure out how you're going to analyze. You should think about how you're going to analyze, and then from there, think about how you're going to get the data and what you're asking. But it should align to your research question, your approach, and your data collection method. And you'll see a lot in qualitative about inductive versus deductive. So deductive is your a priori. So these are codes or ideas that are drawn from existing research and theory, and then inductive, which are the things that are emerging from data. It's rarely exclusively going to be one or the other, because if you're doing deductive, if you're just saying, I'm just going to do purely deductive, then what do you need the data for? And if you are only doing inductive, then you are not taking into account the data that exists, the existing research, the existing theories. So it usually is a combination of those two approaches. Getting into the software, there are a lot here. This is just kind of a different, the range that is out there. Some considerations in terms of coding software. So think about the learning curve and think about the amount of data that you have. So if you're doing something that's pretty small, maybe it was just a couple interviews, or it was, kind of a smaller amount, it might not be worth using a program, because the learning curve of figuring out how to get everything onto the program, figuring out how to use it, you may end up spending more time doing that. And you could have probably just done it within a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet. If you have a larger data set, coding software is really helpful because and I will have all of this available later. We'll share this. And it can be for your software for a larger data set. It can be really helpful because it helps organize the information. So like if you want to pull out all of, this particular code, it will pull up every excerpt for you. And it can help really visualize that information, find the information that you're looking for, and help identify themes. So you kind of have to think about how much data you have and how long you think it'll take you to learn. Another thing that's really important to think about is the ability to collaborate. So some programs are designed to allow for collaborative work and some are not as much. Deduce is one that is really good for collaboration. It's also very cheap, which brings us to cost. So In Vivo is free on Hopkins Safe Desktop. The downside of that is it's kind of through the VPN and it can be frustrating to work with. But that's kind of more of a tech issue. But Deduce is also very affordable. It is about $20 per person per month, and you only have to pay for it as you're using it. And then I also have, this is a link here to a comparison chart that NYU has of a number of different software programs, and takes into account things like ability to collaborate, cost, how things are uploaded, how the data is stored, all of that. Then briefly into codes and coding. So codes are really they're symbolically assigning an attribute to a portion of the qualitative data. This is a highly collaborative process. It's very different from quantitative analysis, because usually with that, it's you and your program, whether it's Stat or SAS or whatever you're using, and it's just you and the data. This is very different because it's an iterative process, and you kind of have to be in constant communication with your team, and it can be quite messy. And if you're used to quantitative research, this can be often the most challenging part of the research process. But just a little bit about kind of what it looks like. So you're starting out with developing your code book. So you want to bring in your a priori codes if you have them, start looking at a few transcripts, and come together as a team and start discussing that preliminary code book. And then you can pilot test that with uncoded data. And then you might go back and update, and then you might try it again with some more data. So you're going back and forth. So it's much more iterative than stepwise. So a couple of things that can help make that process a little easier. I recommend frequent team meetings, at least every 2 weeks, probably at the least. If you can meet every week, that's great. And make sure you're documenting. So if you spend 1 hour, 2 hours doing some coding, take a step back at the end of that and write a memo about what themes you saw and what you noticed or what things were surprising to you. And make sure when you're having those team meetings that you're keeping notes and tracking those conversations, because it is an iterative process, and you will want to go back to those things later. You think you will remember, but it will kind of all start to come together, and you'll forget where things were. A little bit about coding approaches. So you can, and this is important to consider because it will determine how much time you may need in your effort. So split coding is where, let's say we have 15 transcripts. I'm going to take 15. Laura's going to take 15. We're each going to code our 15 transcripts. Then we're going to come together. Laura's going to take a look at mine and say, oh, agree, don't agree. And we're going to reach consensus. And then I'm going to do the same thing with hers. Consensus coding is, you have 30 transcripts. Both of us are going to code all 30. Then we're going to come together and discuss until we reach consensus. And then there's one that is a little bit of a combination, which is really appropriate for large data sets where you may have a lot of coders. You can set an inter-rater reliability threshold. So a minimum of 80%, usually you want it to be a little bit higher. And so you can do consensus work in batches. And once you get to, once your inter-rater reliability for coding is up to 80%, then those two coders can then go forward and code things on their own. For most things, if you're only working with 30 transcripts, you probably don't need to worry about that. If you're doing a longitudinal study and you're looking at, 200 transcripts or something like that, and a number of research assistants, you do want to look at inter-rater reliability. Then just getting slightly into themes, just remember that codes are a tool. So once you're finished coding, you're not finished. Then you have to start to look at what does this all mean? Looking at the patterns, the connections, how things relate. But it's also, as I mentioned, it's iterative. It's not stepwise. So it's not like, let's code and now let's think about themes. As you're having those meetings, as you're working through this, you'll start to identify themes and start to see how things fit together. So it happens it's a messy process that happens. A lot of things happen at once as the connections start to appear in your head. And just remember that your data collection questions are not themes themselves, but they can be helpful in categorizing. So for example, if you're asking about condom use is not a theme, but maybe people, reasons that people don't use condoms, there will be themes under that. And as you're moving forward with the themes, with the coding, with all of it, it's important to take a step back and keep the big picture in mind of what does this mean? What is the significance? What does this matter in practice? And just a couple tips, reflect on your bias. So you want to make sure you do that individually and as a team, and do it frequently. It's not something you can do just once. You kind of have to do it, as you go, and as you're hearing what people say, as you're reading, as you're talking with other people, take your time, document your process, and try to avoid quantifying information. You will, I've seen lots of people do this where you start, but you say, well, this code I saw 25 times. And so, okay, great. But remember, this is not, representativeness is not the goal. So you are looking at themes. You're not looking at 10% of the people said this. You're trying to look at the bigger picture. All right, and I am close to out of time, but couple of things about funding. You want to make sure and this is kind of, I think, coming together with a lot of what I've already said, you want to always know your rationale for qualitative methods. You want to be able to say, here's my question and here's why qualitative methods are the best way to do it. You want to avoid questions that are too broad. Some of what I see is people will say, I'm just going to explore the experience of this group. Okay, but why? What are you hoping to gain from it? Or why does that information matter? Or what specific question are you trying to answer? And make sure you allow adequate time for data collection and analysis. Overall, I would say you should think that a qualitative study is going to take about 10 hours per participant for everything. For data collection, for each interview, I say at least 3 hours for the reaching out, for the interview itself, for the coordination, focus group discussion, 5 to 6 hours to get that group going. Your sampling strategy is going to affect your timeline. If you are maybe going out into a remote village and you're going to do 5 interviews a day and you're just going to, speak to whoever you encounter, you might finish that in 2 weeks. But if you are trying to interview single mothers of children with autism in Baltimore City, it's going to take you longer because you're going to have to find those people. You're going to have to work around their schedule. You're going to have to work around your schedule. So that's going to take time to find those people. And you also have availability issues. So you're not just doing only interviews for 2 weeks. For analysis, that also for your timeline, it's really dependent on the availability of the research team. And I would say it's difficult to really meaningfully participate in analysis and keep it moving forward unless you can dedicate at least 5 or more hours a week. So just to think about that in terms of your timeline and how much effort you are allowing for yourself at different places. Transcription, another thing that's important. So it takes about 4 hours to transcribe an hour of audio. So usually your team should not be doing it because that's a waste of your time. But you can do third-party transcription. And there are a lot of pieces that you have to do, but that is definitely doable. And you should consider the cost. It is quite expensive. Focus group discussions are more expensive than interviews, and poor quality audio is more expensive than high quality audio. And you want to, even if you send it to a third-party transcription service, you want to check it against the recordings to make sure that it's accurate and address it with the company if it's not. And the good news is we are here to support you. So we have started our qualitative service line. So you can use your 20 hours if that's provided by your department. You can write funding for additional hours into your study if your department doesn't provide hours, or if you want more, or you can write leads into your grants. And so you can always reach out to us for estimates if you need to put that into a grant. So key points, the stuff it's Qualitative is complementary to quantitative, important to document and reflect. Embrace lifelong learning and complexity. Everything takes longer than you think it will, like this presentation did, and you don't have to do it alone. So with that, I will open up to questions. I think there may be a few in the chat. All right. So 4 minutes left. So I don't know if, Laura, how we're doing questions, if people have them.
Let's see here. How to connect with BEADs. I was just about to send that email beadcore@jhmi.edu to access our services. Also, there'll be, with Amelia's permission, a copy of the slides will be available and the recording, as well as Suzanne Greeb's presentation on qualitative research from a couple of years ago, which gets into more detail in some of the initial sort of bullet points from this presentation. So between the two of them, it covers a lot of ground. If people are interested, please just email BEAD Core. Any other questions?
Okay, so I see. I will look. I believe that there is. I know of a resource for facilitation skills that can be helpful. That I can share that. It's, I believe, designed for international work, but should be applicable for in person as well. And I can see, sorry, for local as well. But I can share that. And it's, you know, it's important to keep in mind, you don't have to be an expert of everything. So if you don't anticipate that focus group facilitation is something that you're going to use a lot, it's fine to have someone on your team that does that. So we don't all have to be experts at everything.
Hi, I have a quick question. If we are wanting to list BEAD Core support in a grant, do you recommend we set up a meeting with the BEAD Core, you know, while we're writing the grant to discuss the specifics, and how in advance should we set up that meeting before the grant is due?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend reaching out to us. It may not necessarily be a meeting. We may be able to do it via email, but I would give us, just because of vacation and different things, I would try to give us at least a month just to make sure that we have a chance to get all the information through and we don't hold you up on anything.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Amelia, may I add to that quite nice answer? This is Jay, also from the BEAD Core. It's always nice to have Amelia's, or if you're quantitative, one of our other people's input while writing the grant. It might be helpful to have a meeting. We, Laura, please correct me, we often say several weeks lead time is better.
As much lead time as
the
possible.
earlier the better. The later you get, the less high quality thought can go into it. We will try to be be accommodative, but if you have several weeks, that might get a more interesting conversation in that meeting.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Great. And then I just saw, yeah, thank you, Jay. And then I just saw another question about bias while coding. If only the interviewer codes the transcripts, the answer to that would be, it's generally, if at all possible, it's always better to have at least 2 people code transcripts because of that issue of bias. And because it's much easier to be able to identify themes and see how things fit together if you have that person to kind of have a back and forth with. If it's not possible, then you can try to address that. If you can have a second person kind of maybe not do the coding directly, but review what you've done, or someone that you can discuss and reflect with, that's important. And some work you can also do through self-reflection and writing, and kind of at least creating the space for yourself to think about things that surprised you or things that might indicate your own bias.
Excellent. Well, it's 1 o'clock on the nose, so maybe we'll say a big thank you again to Amelia. That was fantastic. The feedback is very positive, and I also learned a lot. So thank you very much. And again, reach out to beadcore@jhmi.edu with more questions.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.